Welcome everyone to season 4 of National Parks Presents. Today is our 6th of 8 presentations that will take place every Wednesday. We started these mid-January and they're going all the way through the end of April, every other Wednesday. So honestly, after today, we have 2 more. I believe it's April 10th and then April 24th. This series goes over a crazy amount of topics, goes over so many things, but tonight's is focusing on a brand new area that I've never heard of. And I grew up right outside Boston my entire life. I've hit regular age now. I thought I knew everything about the Boston Tea Party, and this is a new perspective or a new area that pertains to the Boston Tea Party that I have never heard of, and I am pumped. I'm really, really excited. But before we go into the really fun part that Ranger Chris is going to go into, I do have to go over the boring Zoom features. So we are recording. And to catch up on past recordings, you can go onto the BPL YouTube page. I can also throw it into our website, but you can also Google or web chat. There we go. But you can Google Boston Public Library YouTube, and it will be the first one up there. If you are not enjoying the closed caption button is at the bottom. If you're not enjoying the captions, you can click on that and those words will go away. If you don't have them and you want them, you can click on them and they will start appearing. Also down below is our question button. Feel free to ask the questions, all right? Like I said, it's a topic that not many might know about. And so many questions rolling in. Click on the little chat bubble right there and type away. It's one of the few places that we keep a webinar with this many people that we keep that chat open because everyone has been so friendly and kind. So you are welcome to ask any question. Just be respectful. That's all. As soon as you're not respectful, unfortunately, I got to do some wonderful tech tricks and go bye-bye and have you bounce out. And like other past presentations, the most amazing Ranger of us all, Ranger Sean, will be combing through the chat questions and popping up on the screen to moderate the Q&A with Ranger Chris. All righty. I think that is all the rambling you need to hear from me today. So without further babbling from me, let's welcome Ranger Chris Hall as he presents the Great Bengal Famine and the Boston Tea Party.
All right, thank you, Karen. Hi, folks. How's everyone doing today? I want to thank the Boston Public Library for hosting Boston National Historical Park so I can dive into a topic that I've really found interesting and has expanded really my understanding of the lead up to the American Revolution. What we're going to be talking about today is the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, and how it relates to the Boston Tea Party and the overall American Revolution. I want to start off by saying that this is a work in progress. I'm still expanding my search. So although it's a fuller picture than I've had before, I don't think it's the fullest picture, but I hope it brings you a little closer to a kind of a wider global understanding of the American Revolution and the things that led up to it, including this famine today. Also, I might pronounce a few things incorrectly. Still learning, so please excuse any mispronunciations that you might hear today. But without further ado, why don't we get started? So this here is a painting, drawing, I'm not quite sure what you call it, because it's from a commonplace book, a sailor's book. The sailor's name is Henry Tiffin. He was, I believe, an English sailor, although hardly anything is known about him except for this commonplace book, which is at the Peabody Essex Museum archives. And in this book, he has ship logs, He's doing navigation arithmetic. He is writing your basic day-to-day sailor data. However, he's also writing poetry. Not very good poetry, but poetry. He's writing songs, sometimes funny songs. He, at one point, for about 2 weeks, is going on about the dangers of lust, which he wasn't publishing this book. He was presumably only writing it for himself. So again, maybe people weren't supposed to see this, but we had kind of an overview into one individual's life who sailed all around the places we're going to be talking today. So England, he was over in Bengal, he sails over to New England. I don't always have, at least as of now, a lot of personal primary sources, things like diaries, things like personal letter, that other subjects have really allowed me to engage on the human side of what we're going to be talking about today. But these drawings here in Henry Tiffin's Commonplace book, I think, get us decently close and remind us as we go through this that we're really talking about individuals, even when we use numbers that are in the millions. So take a look at this drawing now, and you can kind of take that in. So if colonists had been free to trade, the historian Jonathan Eaton writes, who I used, his book is one of the main sources, Selling Empire, that I used to really find more primary sources. But he writes that if colonists had been free to trade past the Cape of Good Hope, if they did not deeply desire India's cotton and Indians' cotton and silk and Chinese teas, and if Bengal had not been conquered, and if it hadn't suffered a terrible famine under company rule, the timing and arguments of the American Revolution would have looked significantly different. Now, I came across mentions of the Bengal famine really in passing in a couple of other secondary sources, and it kind of shocked me as I was trying to look into the East India Company and the Boston Tea Party. I should mention we are right at just about the 250th anniversary of the Tea Act, Parliament's response to what is now known as the Boston Tea Party. And as I'm reading, just in passing these couple of sentences, anywhere from 3 to 10 million Bengalis died at the hands of the East India Company, which we'll get into. And I think about how we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. What stories are there left to maybe finish, to maybe tell? What stories haven't been told? Certainly the story of 3 to 10 million deaths that lead up in a way to the Boston Tea Party, which leads up to the American Revolution, really caught my eye. So when I studied the Boston Tea Party, as many of you have kind of growing up, which you heard about, I always heard the reason, the inspiration, was anger against taxes. The colonists did not want to pay a new tea tax. And the tea tax was a revenue tax put out by Parliament. And it it was taxing tea 3 cents per pound. The company was eligible to be granted a license to export tea to North America. And the company was no longer required to sell its tea at London tea auctions. It was given a monopoly. Duties on the tea charged in Britain, which was destined for North America and other foreign parts, would either be refunded on export or not imposed on the company. Consignees, folks who were receiving the tea in bulk, receiving the company's tea, were required to pay a deposit upon receipt of the tea, and the revenue from that tax would go to pay the salaries of colonial officials. So what's that mean for the everyday colonist? This 3 cent per pound tax on tea from a company that was gaining a monopoly. Well, for the everyday colonist, this meant tea was going to be cheaper. Tea was going to be more affordable. And tea was used at this point in everyday life. It was indispensable in just social. There was rituals around it, and it was drank how we would drink coffee today. So this reason behind the Boston Tea Party that I'd always heard, an anger against this tax, it really confused me. I was wondering, well, it wasn't economic at that point. Was it maybe the influence of colonial merchants who, might have at that point been illegally smuggling tea? Did they were about to be put out of business, at least as far as the tea trade goes? And did their overwhelming influence really serve to kind of bring everyone else along with them? Historians in the early 20th century, like Arthur Schlesinger, and in the early 21st century, like H.V. Bowen, have both argued that this colonial merchant influence widened the scope to greater public opposition to the East India Company and the tea tax. And while I hold these arguments to have aspects of truths and to illustrate part of the story, I still wasn't completely satisfied. It still felt like there was something missing that would inspire 5,000 people to pack into the Old South Meeting House on the night of the Boston Tea Party, and for them to throw the 100 or so folks participating in the Boston Tea Party to throw 46 tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. So I expanded my search, and maybe it was ideological. Maybe the folks against the East India Company and the tea tax did not like that a monopoly was being bestowed and the dangers that implied on a single company. Historians such as Gordon would have argued as much. I believe there are certainly aspects of truth to this ideological argument, but that still wasn't really giving me the full picture. And I came to it studying, looking closer at the famine in Bengal. It's about sovereignty, supreme power and authority. In this case, taxation, who gets to impose taxes, enforce collecting those taxes? How is that authority wielded? And at what lengths will the holder of that sovereignty, that supreme authority, go to collect those taxes? So the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, which is estimated 3 million to 10 people died in, happened in part because of actions and policies enacted by the East India Company for the purpose of collecting taxes in India. In 1774, Jonathan Shipley, he's the Bishop of Asaph, and he's a member of the House of Lords. He's a friend of Ben Franklin's. We're going to talk about him a little bit more later. But he wrote in defense of the colonists after act upon act was being taken against them. He wrote in defense that he says, "What misery this right of taxation is capable of producing in provincial government. We need only recollect that our countrymen in India, having the space of 5 or 6 years, virtue of this right, destroyed, starved, and driven away more inhabitants from Bengal than are found in all of the American colonies." So that really struck out at me. This is a widely circulated pamphlet. Again, we'll talk about it more, but this widely circulated pamphlet says that the company which has gained a monopoly in America has killed, essentially, according to Shipley, the population of America. Now, Jonathan Eaton goes on to say that the East India Company became a company to fear as an actual example of unrepresentative and exploitive rule within the British Empire. Monopolies and taxations were powers granted by the British government and exercised by the East India Company over Bengal and other parts of India. The root problem that America had with the Tea Act was not so much taxation. Finally, I'm getting someone else who's trying to expand this argument beyond taxation. Eaton goes on to say, rather, the act made more direct the economic and political linkages between America and the monopolistic and sensationally despotic East India Company, again, causing the deaths of so many people. At precisely the moment that Bengal and America appeared to inhabit similar positions within the greater imperial constitution. The East India Company was more than just a company in the traditional sense. They were granted sovereignty and were allowed a private military force to defend and enforce their sovereignty. Once the East India Company gained a foothold in America, and this is an argument that John Dickinson will make, would America meet the same fate as Bengal? So these are the questions being asked around. But first, we should ask ourselves, how did it come that the East India Company got these powers? Well, it starts with a battle. But before that, I do want to give a brief word on the history of the origins of the East India Company. They were founded in England in 1600 as a joint stock adventure to trade in the Indian Ocean region and later East Asia. The company was awarded a royal charter which granted them a monopoly on English trade with all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. In the first decades in the first decades of the 20th century, excuse me, in the first decades of the 18th century, rather, Parliament passed two Calico Acts. Calico was fabric. It was named after the Indian city of Calicut. Think cotton and the like, and we'll talk about that more. The two Calico Acts, alongside other new trading regulations, codified new functions for colonists as distinct consumers of Indian goods within the empire's economic system. So that's to say, like, their role, right? Their role within the empire, the colonists' role as they know it. If you listen to certain historians, they still had memories, thinking of Bernard Bailyn, say, but they still had memories of the English Civil War, of civic participation. And now, through trade regulation, their role is changing within the empire, and they don't really have a say in it. And by compromising to protect both English manufacturers and the East India Company's trade in Asia, or to Asia, the acts would further shift the political, legal, and economic emphasis away from using the colonies to cultivate Asian raw materials for English manufacturing goods imported to London by the East India Company. See, on the one hand, Calico Act, it gave the colonists consumer freedom. It expanded their consumer freedom. But on the other hand, that freedom depended on an increasingly entrenched belief that colonists were not equal to English subjects, or after the 1707 Union Act, to British subjects as either producers or consumers. Then this is because they could not, the colonists, because of the monopoly that the East India Company had, they couldn't engage in trade in the same way, either at the producer level, the consumer level, in the sense that technically they didn't have a choice, although smuggling certainly, as we know, did happen, or even at the middleman level. Instead, the colonists were different types of subjects altogether now, to be used to support not only English or British shippers and manufacturers, but also the East India Company through the consumption of monopolized goods. So what did newfound consumer freedom look like in the colonies? Well, it shaped, for one, the individual's public presentation, really at all levels of society, the way they used fashion to signal their status. Wealthy families could purchase fine calico. They could also purchase things like muslin and silk for themselves, finer wear. But because of this monopoly and because of all the fabric being produced in India at this time, they could also purchase inexpensive, coarse cotton fabrics for their servants and for their enslaved laborers. Lower sorts, free families, they could tailor moderately expensive India fabrics into nicer Sunday clothing for special table living. All things that project where you stand in society. Even some enslaved people who had the desire and found the opportunity to obtain their fashionable clothing made from Indian fabrics, used such clothing sometimes to pass as free. I found a, excuse me here, interesting newspaper newspaper ad about this, in which it states that an enslaved person who is trying to self-emancipate, is wearing calico. And there's a difference here between wearing, someone's described as wearing calico, because other advertisements from the time will describe an enslaved person has, quote, stolen calico. So it's something that even enslaved people can use to project in society that they are not what class society tells them. They're projecting freedom by using this relatively newfound, at least in numbers, uh, this fabric because of the East India Company. Now, like I said, these fabrics were quite popular at the time. And some of the finer Indian fabrics and fashions were even appropriated. Umbrellas, for example, were newly introduced in the colonies. They were seen as fashionable. These first actually get big in the southern colonies because it's hotter there, blocks out the sun. But the trend will move northward, and umbrellas become a status symbol in cities like Philadelphia and Boston. Now, again, these are imported by the East India Company. Well, what happens when someone wants, as means of political protest, to not buy these imports anymore, but they still want their umbrellas? They start being manufactured on this side of the ocean. So you see at the top of this advertisement, not imported at the very top, whereas this one, sent in, not imported. I thought that was another interesting little fact there. Excuse me. Well, the fashions were quite popular. Indian fashion. Folks like Nicholson and Thomas Boylston often went out wearing these calicos, banyans, for example, in the East Indian style, loose form fitting clothes. At one point it says they were so popular, gentlemen you could see, quote, at all times of day and abroad in the streets. A ship captain, Captain Robinson, he fell overboard. He was ship captain of the Oliver, and he is described as wearing Scotch plaid when he is fallen into the ocean, eaten by sharks. A horse thief, Nathan McMullen, is described as sometimes wearing banyans and ruffles. Even at Harvard University today, banyans became so popular. This Indian style of these fine fabrics became so popular that they were forbidden during commencement ceremonies. So these fine fabrics, this trade, gave the East India Company quite a bit of power. But how did they get this kind of newly found power? They did so on June 23rd in 1747 at the Battle of Plessy. I'm going to very briefly mention the Battle of Plessy, which gives the East India Company quite a bit of control and a treaty that really solidifies that control. I could give an entire talk on these two subjects, so excuse me. I'm not trying to trivialize or generalize, but just to say that there's a lot more to this story, but the Battle of Plessy took place in the 7 Years' War, 7 Years' War, global conflict fought between France and England. And this battle was a decisive victory for the British East India Company under the leadership of Robert Clive, who you see triumphantly pictured there. This painting is from the 1800s over the Nawab of Bengal, a leader, essentially a term, and his French allies. So the company has an army of 3,000 strong, including 800 Indian troops. Mind you, private military. Whereas the Nawab Dowla, he commanded 50,000 men, including artillery and artillery officers loaned by the French. However, Clive, who's at this point touted as a military hero, he had formerly been a clerk, just a middle-level clerk, manages, despite the uneven numbers, to really gain control of a large part of Bengal. It's interesting to note Clive was a clerk. A lot of middling sort people who normally wouldn't have had power in society are gaining power and wealth and fortunes, ill-got or not, through the East India Company. It's something you see throughout, that as the empire expands, these fortunes are being made, and these men are rising up in society. So following the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company continued to conquer more territory, and step by step, by way of force, bribery, and maneuvering, the East India Company crept from the river of Calcutta to devour the rest of the province of Bengal. In doing so, the company also found a new source of profit, which is far larger, so it was thought, than had ever been seen before. So on August 16th of 1765, the Treaty of Allahabad is signed by Clive, and it basically signifies the entire control of the province. The emperor of the Mughals, he signs the treaty, Ali Habib, giving the East India Company, awarding them Diwani, which is he gets the right. The East India Company is awarded the right to collect taxes. This painting is by Benjamin West. You might be familiar with him here, but this is quite a triumphant picture of what is going to be an eventual devastation. But the East India Company gaining control to collect taxes was a really big deal. Securing the territorial revenues of Bengal, also Bihar and Orissa for the East India Company. The company had access now to an infrastructure to collect silver now, because a lot of this currency, these taxes were collected in hard currency. So massive amounts of wealth comes in. Now, normally the people collecting the Diwani, the taxes, were all supposed to be governing officials, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But how the treaty is worked out, the East India Company does not have to do any of the infrastructure governing work. All they have to do is collect the taxes. So it's gaining the infrastructure, but changing the system in which that infrastructure is balanced. Before the Treaty of 1763, British debt amounted to more than 133 million British pounds. Parliament needed to decide how to use expanding empire to help pay for the costs of its expansion. And the Treaty of Allahabad presented an opportunity to help that debt. Customs revenue on goods imported from Asia more than doubled after the Treaty of 1765, from just over 430,000 British pounds in 1763 to 64 to nearly 890,000 British pounds in 1769, 1770. So the East India Company, at this point, their imports generated more than 11% of the British government's income, all while being only 2% of British shipping tonnage. So America, right, from the British perspective now, the American wilderness really offered nothing to Great Britain other than a draining of resources, both of soldiers and of money, whereas as Bengal, with the ability to collect the money, the taxes, it was an asset of the most tangible kind from a global trading perspective. So Chinese accountants in Canton, let's pull up this other map here. Here's a map of the world that the East India Company is dealing with. Canton, you see there on the right of the map, was heavily controlled. And that is where the tea came from. And it had the most power. They wouldn't barter, they wouldn't take credit, they would only take silver. But now that the East India Company had access to silver through this tax collection, they could really try to even out the global trading power balance at this point. So this is a big deal in London. You know, reaction has been described as euphoric. When the treaty goes into effect in the spring of 1776, Clive sends word to London, and the price of the East India Company's stocks soars in hope of ample dividends to come. Stock leaped up by more than 50%. And since the China trade was booming too, the price went on climbing the following year as well. By the spring of 1768, the company's stock was trading nearly at 280 British pounds, the highest price it would ever attain. So this news, again, was received considerably, got a considerable amount of press from the London press. And the London press would circulate in America. So news traveled through newspapers like the Pennsylvania Gazette, the Virginian Gazette, the Boston Gazette. There's even a German paper in Pennsylvania that's publishing about it. And there were 4 times as many newspapers in the American colonies than there were in the rest of the British Empire. In New England, at least, literacy was at a very high rate. So this information is traveling around fast, and there's concern about British conduct in India. There's rumors about extensive corruption and condemnation of what are now termed nabobs. It's a kind of derivative of a new way of company servants of newly acquired fortunes, which were supposedly in very large sums. So with the China trade doing so well, the in Bengal increasing year by year, the company's earnings run in 1771 into a peak of more than $1 million British pounds. But enormous though they seemed on paper, the bulk of these processes, profits that arose in India, the hard currency itself that flowed back home to London was a much smaller sum. While the tea trade appeared to be thriving, it absorbed huge quantities of silver from Spain. Silver was controlled by the Spanish Empire. And this was a problem. Inevitably, the price of bullion, i.e. silver, had risen, threatening to erode the profit margins on which the company relied. So in response, the East India Company thought of a cunning but ultimately disastrous plan. With what appeared to be brilliant ingenuity at the time, the East India Company directors found a new way to make India yield up enormous profits, at least on paper. In the late 1760s, as a way to obtain bullion in Bengal, they began to allow their managers in Calcutta to write out IOUs to local English merchants, credit essentially, most of whom worked for the company. So, and the company had accommodated their own private hoards of silver, essentially, from Calcutta to the bullion that sailed to China, where the IOUs came home to London to be redeemed when the tea that was obtained in China was sold. For the people of Bengal, this led to hardship because the silver in their economy, which their economy ran on, was really completely draining. And that money could have been used to go to finance things like tools, livestock, irrigation. It's what it had been used for, amongst many other things traditionally. But for the British, this plan seemed ideal. The scheme gave the company working capital it needed and allowed its traders to send money back to England in what seemed to be a cheap and efficient way. But what if the officials in Bengal were tempted to go too far by issuing IOUs on such a scale that the East India Company had never foreseen? And this is precisely what happens. This bubble starts to burst at the same moment that catastrophic famine hits. As an aside, meanwhile, during this time as well, the Townsend Acts are being passed in America, putting greater restrictions and regulations on America. I'm not going to go through them now for the sake of time, but Americans see that they're being really regulated much more. New wealth is coming to the East India Company, who had previously never seen it. Some of their company servants are actually influencing Parliament, being elected to Parliament. So this is foreseen. So right after the Townsend duties are passed in America, the year after, in the autumn of 1768, really going to the 1769, crop failure occurs in Bengal, in Bihar, due to low rainfall. So Ecott writes that on the plains of India, everything depends on the monsoon. In the summer of 1769, the rain came too late. To the valley of the Ganges, in some places, rain never fell at all. Even before the drought, the economy had begun to wither under the blight of the land tax. And eager to strip every rupee that the East India Company could from Bengal, the British had also driven up the price of food by stockpiling scarce supplies of grain to be sold at profit. By the end of October, a famine had begun. It continued until the following year. The victims filled the streets of Calcutta, where it was said nearly 80,000 people died. By the time the famine had run its course, the East India Company, by its own assessments, believed that 10 million people had lost their lives. Modern estimates points to a lower figure, but one that still certainly runs in the millions. And the suffering was worst precisely in the locations where the East India Company land revenue had arose in rural areas in Bihar, excuse my pronunciation, Murshidabad. In Murshidabad, 500 people were thought to be dying of starvation every single day. During this time period, the price of rice rose by May of 1770 to 4 times the normal level, and eventually it would rise to 10 times the normal level. And in many places, rice just wasn't available at all. The receipts that were collected from the taxes began to dwindle, while the company continued to spend heavily. There was also talk of war, not only in the south, but also against a new so-called enemy, the Marathas in the west. So running scared of simultaneous attacks on Bombay and Madras, the company men in India scrambled for cash to hire more sea power and pay for more fortifications. Top of that, because of this famine, lack of food, people are moving from rural areas to the cities. Traditionally, there had been stockpiles of grain for these occasions. There was infrastructure for these famines, and people from the rural areas would go to the cities. Well, that helped cause an outbreak of smallpox. So on top of the famine, top of the economic decline, also have smallpox. So this news is starting to hit America. You can see a political cartoon here. This is published in England. As the news is starting to hit the East India man wrecked. He's being held up. He's balancing, and on the bottom is a ship that's on the rocks. So word is starting to get around. The Massachusetts spy. This is reported in many newspapers. I was able to find exact images from the spy, but it's other papers as well. Because the way these newspapers work is articles are circulated. Remember, there are 4 times as many newspapers in America than there are in the west of the British Empire. So these articles are going around from places like Boston up to New Hampshire, Philadelphia, New York, down south, Virginia, Maryland. So in this article from 1771, it's printed a letter, an officer extracted from a letter of an officer in Bengal. This letter is dated September 4th, 1770, published in 71. And it says, "You will undoubtedly receive very shocking accounts of the famine in Bengal, Bihar, Orissa," and then he stops, "nay, all of India." He starts to list all the areas where there is bad famine, and he gives up, "nay, all of India." It's too many to write. He goes on, "There has been a dearth so far very great from the last 6 months in the company's district alone, that up to millions have died upon moderate computation." He also writes that life amongst the East India Company, though, isn't changing very much, at least outwardly. He says, "Balls, concert, and all public entertainment ought to subside at this time of general scarcity, but I am very sorry to say that they have not." And another article goes on to say, "The misery occasioned by the famine in the province of Bengal is incredible. I believe I speak within compass when I say at least 2 million souls have perished within these few months. The Europeans have suffered greatly, not so much from the famine as from pestilential disorder, which is the general consequence of it." Remember, smallpox is going around. At this time, you have the burning of the Gaspee British merchant ship off the coast of Rhode Island. So people are starting to not like everything that's going on. I'm not saying the famine is causing things like the gas being burnt, but this is within the greater conversation of things like the Townsend Acts and different regulations. Another newspaper article goes on to say the cruelties exercised upon the innocent natives of Bengal. Um, they have a scene of rapine that has been carried on there by the servants of the company. Um, and he calls aloud to heaven itself for vengeance and demands the utmost attention of the legislator to prevent this evil from becoming irredeemable. It goes on to say, I wish something official may be accomplished before the houses of parliament separate, before they take a recess, a break. But I much doubt that they will not be able to get at the bottom of the mischief and of course be obliged to leave things as they are. There are many rich villains to be dragged out into the open by day, but their very plunder screens them and will enable them to evade the blow. So here you see public blame is shifting to Parliament for allowing, for granting, this monopoly, for getting a lot of members of Parliament getting rich off the stock. It's being really, it enrages people in at least the opinion sections. So on May 10th of 1773, the Tea Act is passed. Essentially, the Townsend duties, they're done away with, but the tax on tea will remain. In 1773, it's also discovered that Bengal bills, the IOUs I talked about before, were hidden from account balances. So once this was announced publicly, stock prices plummeted. Investors secretly purchased stock on the cheap through Dutch investment banks. Stock plummets, company secretly buys more. That's announced. But as really never rebounds, 11 banks in England and Scotland collapsed due to this panic, and the economic panic spreads to Holland and America. Anyone who had purchased IOU credits from the East India Company, those credits are now worthless. So the East India Company sort of gets punished. It's more of a slap on the wrist. They get punished with the Regulating Act, which puts more authority in Parliament to control what the East India Company is doing. Their president, Hastings, he is forced to retire. Clive will start to retire at this point too, in disgrace. He'd been a war hero. But there's only one person punished, and that is actually not an English person, but it is an Indian, higher up Indian servant for the East India Company. One person gets punished. Everyone else gets away essentially scot-free. So Thomas Powell, he's a member of Parliament. He had been a former governor of Massachusetts Bay from 1757 to 1760. He'd been a lieutenant governor of New Jersey before that. He's seen as a moderate, and he'd already written a big tract on the colonies about what to do in this problem. He actually had called for a empirical parliament for everyone to get representation, not out of any love for liberty, but just out of more of a desire for order. He's again worked in England. He's been over in the colonies. So he writes a pamphlet in response to the Regulating Act and Tea Act. He writes, the right and duty of the state as concerned in the affairs of the East Indies. And his main point of this pamphlet is that the problem in the East Indies is that the merchant has become the sovereign. And he'll say it's not even the merchant's fault. He doesn't put blame on them. He says the natural inclination of the merchant is to make as much profit as possible. Adam Smith will actually go on to criticize the East India Company in acting this way, saying it's not free trade when he publishes The Wealth of Nations a few years later. Benjamin Rush, also over in Pennsylvania, becomes good friends with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. He writes a series of pamphlets called The Alarm, in which Rush compares the excess operations of the East India Company to the, quote, barbarities of Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century. He also will say that the machinations of the enemies of our country, the East India Company and Parliament, to enslave us by means of the East India Company, excuse me. He's essentially saying that by design, America is being enslaved by the East India Company. Here you're also seeing kind of a national-ish identity start to emerge in the idea of the other, because the subjects of the colonies believe they are legitimate voting members of Britain. They deserve liberty, versus how people in East India or African enslaved people are being treated. So through kind of seeing this othering, you start to see that in the language as well. Jonathan Shipley, though, will I mentioned him earlier. He is the Scottish bishop. He's friends with Ben Franklin. He's a member of the House of Lords. He writes a speech defending Massachusetts, a pamphlet that was intended as a speech, he calls it, in which he says, "We need only recollect that our countrymen in India have, in the space of 5 or 6 years, in virtue of this right to collect taxes, destroyed, starved, and driven away more inhabitants from Bengal than are to be found at present in all our American colonies. More than all those formidable numbers which we have been nursing up for the space of 200 years with so much care and success, to the astonishment of Europe." Shipley's pamphlet is heavily circulated around America. It's published at least 4 times. And Abigail Adams even writes about it to John Adams, as after the powder alarm, as colonists are starting to hoard gunpowder. And she's writing that the governor, the royal governor of Boston, Massachusetts, making all kinds of warlike preparations. They're putting cannon up on Beacon Hill. They're digging entrenchments upon the neck. They're placing cannon there. They're encamping regiments. They're throwing up breastwork, et cetera, and the people are much alarmed in consequence of the powders being taken from Charlestown, the powder alarm. A general alarm has spread through many towns and was caught pretty soon here, current day Quincy and Braintree, Massachusetts. The report took here Friday, and a Sunday soldier was seen lurking about the common, supposed to be a spy, but most likely he was a deserter. However, intelligence of it was communicated to other parishes, and about 8 o'clock on Sunday evening, there passed by here 200 men, preceded by a horse cart, and marched down to the powder house, from whence they took the powder and carried it off. She writes, "I opened the window upon their return, and they passed without a noise." You know, they're moving secretly. Not a word among them, till they came against this house, when some of them, perceiving me, asked if I wanted any powder. I replied no, since it was in such good hands. The reason they gave for taking it was that we had so many Tories here that they dare not trust it in their hands. So this is what's going on in Greater Boston. And in this very same letter, she writes that people are circulating and discussing Jonathan Shipley's pamphlet. In the same letter, she's talking to Samuel Quincy and his wife, who had Samuel Quincy had participated in the Boston Massacre trials, and they're going back and forth. And she remarks that they said both greatly admired the most excellent speech of the Bishop of St. Affet, which I suppose you have seen. It meets and most certainly merits great ecumenies. So everyone's reading this pamphlet that is blaming and not trusting the East India Company. John Adams will even mention that this pamphlet gives the Massachusetts protest movement legitimacy in his Novalingus letters. And that leads to kind of the influence here. The Boston Tea Party has happened. Gunpowder is being hoarded in word through newspapers, through pamphlets, and even letters are being circulated. And so much so, that people will destroy 46 tons of tea, not because of just the taxes, but because of the company behind those taxes, the power granted them, and the lengths it is known that they'll go to collect and hoard these taxes, leads up to such distrust that that the Boston Tea Party happens. And I've gone over my time, so kind of stumble into a conclusion there, but I do want to cut it off now because I want to be respectful of your time. But I hope that gives you a better understanding of where the Bengal famine of 1770 fits into the Boston Tea Party and the Greater American Revolution. I want to thank you, and if the folks running things still have time, I'll welcome questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Definitely a subject I did not know as much about, so I really appreciate you sharing that. All right, so I did want to get a couple of questions, and again, as you said, want to be cognizant of time, so just want to touch upon a few here. So, let's see. Someone just asked, was there any significant outrage over the civil rights situation with the famine?
I haven't read specifically about civil rights. Some of the secondary sources I've looked at have argued that the famine created kind of an othering amongst the people of Bengal, and that not that they deserve what happened, but it certainly shouldn't be happening to British subjects. The people in Bengal were not British subjects. There was outrage, but not that I have found. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but not that I found with civil rights.
Sure. And then we'll do one more here and then can turn it back over to Karen. So in your research, did you find that due to the British forcing the growing of opium and indigo instead of additional food storage, or additional food for storage in Bengal as a major cause of the famine once rains didn't come? And also, did you come across the Chinese accepting opium as payment for their tea?
That's an interesting question. No, but because from what I've read of how this situation was handled, and the East India Company was really in bad shape. they started to grow opium as a cash crop and selling it to China. So opium did not play, from what I've read, a significant role in this particular famine. But the consequences of this famine will bring about the greater opium issues that bring on famines and wars, etc. Later.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Chris.
Sure. I do want to say, if you guys have any other questions, again, I really want to thank you for your attention today. My email is right up there on the screen. Feel free to email any questions you might have. I'm also happy to share my works cited list with you as well, if anyone's interested in that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. We can turn it over to Karen to close us out.
Oh my goodness. You know me. I'm always flabbergasted about what I learned in everything that we've gone over. Chris, this was amazing and very, very well thought out. Thank you so much. I also learned more about the geography, because that is a true blind spot in my wisdom. So thank you so much. And for anyone who's interested, on April 10th will be our 7th of 8 presentation of National Parks Presents, and it will focus more on American Revolution in more of music, and it kind of goes into a deep dive of WBCN. WBCN, is that what I just read? What did I just read? Oh yeah, WBCN 104.1, and how it the sound of revolution in the 60s and 70s, musically wise, in Boston. As you can see, past 7 o'clock, I shouldn't talk anymore. So I'm going to let everyone get going. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful time.